London, and it really is my privilege to welcome all of you to this event, Capitals and COVID, How Londoners and Parisians See Their City. Now, I'm a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist, and most of my life has actually been spent studying very small microscopic receptors. So I don't particularly have a standing in either capitals or COVID, but perhaps I do bring one experience to this, and that is the experience of having lived in 5 wonderful cities in my life. I was born in the wonderfully enigmatic city of Montreal in Canada. I then lived in the busy, bustling, teeming city of New Delhi. And then I had the pleasure of studying and working in the great city of Toronto. And I was very fortunate that when I was there were great urban thinkers like Jane Jacobs and Richard Florida who were there. And then I spent 5 years in a city that claims to be the world's most livable city. And if you're wondering which that one is, it's Melbourne. And now I'm delighted to be in London. And I have to say, I've lived and loved in all these wonderful cities, each with their own charms and possibilities, but I largely took them for granted. I thought they just worked. I mean, I thought sometimes they didn't work, but largely I never wondered how they worked. They were always vibrant and dynamic. They were a source of financial might and sociocultural drive. And then came COVID. Now, pandemics destroying cities is nothing new. In the 14th century, when the Black Death first came to Europe, it wiped out half the population of Venice. In the 17th century, when the plague came to London with the Exodus, more than half the people fled the city. So in many ways, you could say, well, this has been a relatively benign pandemic by those standards. And in a way, yes. But I think there is something particularly different from the point of view of cities this time. And that is, we have found a new way of working. And while we can look to history and learn lessons about how cities respond to pandemics and all sorts of great disasters, I think this time it will be different because of this working from home business. And it's just unclear how the digital transformation will actually intervene with the future of cities. So I'm really delighted that 2 great universities who have a long history in their own cities and are firmly rooted in the history of their cities have come together to address this question. And I'm really excited about the breadth of topics you're going to address today, everything from social cohesion to housing to economic impact to actually the priorities for recovery. And I'm really thankful that we're doing this in partnership with one of the world's leading public opinion companies in Ipsos Mori, but also in our instance here with contributions from our mayor's office. Now, I can tell you universities study many things, and as a president, I have the privilege of opening many such conferences. But I think this one is different in 2 fundamental ways. First is that what will happen to great cities is critical for the lives and livelihoods of universities. Our students are drawn to great universities like the Université de Paris and King's College and other universities because we are right in the heart of great bustling cities. And of course, thousands of our staff come to work in these great cities. They make them what they are. So universities don't just have an abstract interest in this issue. We've really got skin in the game in the issue of cities and COVID. And the other thing is the pace of change. We at universities often study things which are sort of slow-mo moving. We study archaeology, we study subatomic particles. They don't change month by month. But this is a most dynamic and evolving matter. And whenever you're dealing with such life-changing, in many ways, dynamic matters, of course, you first try to document them, you describe them, you define them. But as things progress, we should be in a situation to understand them, to perhaps predict, and ideally to influence real-world policies. So my hope is that you will enjoy the wonderful speeches that are to follow and the question and answer session that does. But in some sense, I'm hoping that the seminar marks the start of a journey, a first step in a long and enduring partnership of understanding where we first describe and document today, but hopefully we understand and influence tomorrow. So with those words, and with a very warm welcome to all of you, I hand you over to this panel and to the next session. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kshitij, for that excellent introduction, putting it in that broader context. And I'm hoping that the session that we have today showed you some hopeful signs for the future of cities from our study. And certainly that's something that we'll be working on closely together and with others at King's. So I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm director of the Policy Institute here at King's, and it's a real genuine pleasure for me to chair this event today on capitals and COVID. And it's a pleasure for a number of reasons, some of which Kshitij touched on. The partnership with University of Paris is core to that, and it's been a real pleasure to be working with colleagues from University of Paris on this study over the longer term. But also our partnership, our long-standing research partnership with Ipsos Mori, which has been core to this study and touches on lots of our other work as well. And I think you'll see from the presentations that the depth of research that we've managed to build together from this can be the basis for understanding things now, but also the basis for an ongoing research program between University of Paris colleagues and us. And I think and I hope that it will be a model for future work with other cities, because I think there are, as Kshitij's introduction outlined, there's a lot of commonality in the challenges being faced that COVID has brought to the fore. But the main reason I'm delighted to be chairing this today is that we have such an excellent panel for you to present and discuss the findings. So I'm going to break it up a little bit by introducing King's and University of Paris colleague first, who's going to both run us through the findings, give a little presentation of some of the key points from that, and then I'll introduce the panel just to break up the flow of the endless stream of introductions that we would have otherwise. So first we'll hear from Dr. Jack Brown, who is a lecturer in London Studies in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. Then we'll hear from Professor Renaud Lagoire, who is Professor of Human Geography at the University of Paris. And as I say, one of the delights of being working with Renaud and colleagues in pulling this type of, this research together and then the interpretation of it. So we do have question and answer function on the Zoom. So do think of your questions as Jack and Renaud are presenting. Get them in early. I suspect we've got a big audience, so I suspect we'll have a lot of questions coming through. So please, first up, Dr. Jack Brown.
Thank you ever so much, Bobby. Just one second while I do the traditional screen share. Here we go. Okay, so I'm Dr. Jack Brown, very pleased to be part of this illustrious and, as Bobby says, large in number panel. They said you couldn't do quality and quantity. We've done both, I believe, myself obviously exempt from that, but very happy to be here and to be part of this, as Bobby says, a wonderful partnership between the two universities and Ipsos Mori. Two universities based in two of our world's greatest global cities. And what a time to have done this research. So I've got just about 10 minutes, try and do it in a little bit less, to introduce some of the headline findings of our incredibly detailed work, polling Londoners and Parisians on the eve of the pandemic in 2019 and again in 2021, highlighting some of the key similarities and differences between these two global cities and their residents' experiences of those cities and perceptions of city life, how this has changed throughout the pandemic as well. For these headlines, just worth a kind of caveat before we get going, I'm going to refer to Greater London, which Londoners will know as the area that the mayor is in control of, area of about 9 million people, but also to Greater Paris, to Grand Paris, which is a kind of a comparable area mainly in terms of population. So the governance, the administration is slightly different, but these are kind of comparably sized areas. And like I say, I'm just going to make some headline observations before my Parisian colleague will present some of the more detailed or granular findings. So let's get going. First off, this may seem a slightly strange place to start, but I was very pleasantly surprised by these findings. Satisfaction with people's local areas in both cities, in both Greater London and Greater Paris, remains pretty much undented. Now, you could assume that with successive lockdowns, with people locked into their local neighbourhoods, a city where people view their accommodation as a kind of a means to an end to provide access to a city centre where all the jobs are, there's an entirely possible situation whereby people would actually dislike their local areas more and more by being locked down in them, right? That could have been a finding. But satisfaction with local areas has remained essentially undented, which is positive and even slightly increasing there in Greater Paris. Something for people involved in local government to be pleased about as well. Local services are also seen as having improved, if anything. Satisfaction with local services has gone up in both cities between 2019 and 2021. This is really good. This was not inevitable. And so this is a positive finding. And it means that, or at least suggests to us, people actually like where they live in these cities. And this is, this is not something to be taken for granted. Relatedly, we haven't seen a huge increase in the number of people who are expecting to move out of either city in the next 5 years. The kind of mass exodus from large cities that Professor Kapoor mentioned in the introduction that has happened in the past may not, it doesn't look like it's building up in this particular case. Despite these repeated lockdowns and the fact that you can actually work from home in London, even more so than Paris, but both cities have a large percentage of people who've been able to work at home. But despite this, there hasn't been a mass shift, a huge increase in the number of people who are planning to move elsewhere. And there has been some research done elsewhere that suggested that London has lost some of its population during the pandemic due to a combination of Brexit and coronavirus, particularly sort of European migrant workers sort of returning home when things got locked down, things like hospitality. We don't really know the numbers. There are different estimates, but it's quite shaky at the moment. But what's interesting here is that of people who are still in the city, there hasn't been a massive transformation, slight increase in London, and pretty much the same in Paris, the number of people who are expecting to be moving out. And you would expect some churn, that's kind of quite normal, part of city life. So the appeal of global cities broadly likely to endure. But there are differences between the two cities, important differences as well. So there's some similarities in the global city thing there, but there are differences. We noticed that in Greater London, people were much more likely to agree that their local area, people from different social, ethnic or religious backgrounds got on well together. So social cohesion is at least perceived to be much better in Greater London than it is in Greater Paris, or significantly better. And this is even more true when we talk about whether or not citizens in each city are positive about immigration from outside of their nation, international immigration. Londoners are about twice as likely to agree that this has had a positive impact on their city than Parisians. Now, I know Renaud's going to break this down a little bit more, there's more behind it, but the general impression here is that London is viewed as a more sort of successful multicultural city with greater community cohesion than Grand Paris, at least. And so perhaps room for improvement there. But this is not to say that all of our findings were entirely positive for London at all. Results suggest that relations between different cultures and religions may be better, but London appears to be a worse city in which to be a woman. Londoners, female Londoners, much more likely to report street harassment or higher incidence rates of street harassment than their Parisian equivalents. So there's a serious issue there as well. Neither city is perfect for all of its residents. There are problems there that we have been drawn towards. London is also seen as a place primarily for the rich and the young. Some of our other polling, not the poll I have on the slide right now, but some of our other polling in this project has suggested that London is seen as a good place to start a business, a good place to start a career, but not a very good place to start a family. It's a more expensive place. Housing affordability is seen as more of an issue. In effect, a place of great opportunity, but this does come at a higher cost. There's a higher risk there. And so Londoners more likely to perceive their city as a place for the rich and the young. Parisians slightly more optimistic about their city as a place for families, for older people, for poor people. So London, probably some room to improve there as well. Let's return, just before I hand over, let's return to some of the similarities. This is overwhelmingly, I guess, quite a negative thing, that there is incredibly high concern in both cities about climate change and about local green issues as well, more local green issues like air quality, green spaces, but also climate change on a global scale. The positive side of that is that this amount of concern does kind of go with at least a tolerance, if not an active enthusiasm for policies to address this. And again, I believe Renaud's going to talk through some of these policies in more detail, but there is a kind of consensus that we need to do something, and that people in both cities are willing for that to happen. So that's a positive out of a negative. But I do like to finish in a kind of optimistic way. I think I've been quite optimistic overall. But in closing, it's worth noting both cities share a broad optimism about their futures. So a majority in both Greater London and Greater Paris expect that their respective cities will bounce back from the economic and social impact of the coronavirus pandemic. This impact has been sizable, but it's very much a minority opinion that the idea that the city will never recover. There's a bit of difference over whether it will be a quick recovery or a slower and more bumpy recovery, but there's broad consensus that cities will recover. So the idea of the significant kind of global capital city is not over just yet. On that, thank you very much. I will hand over to Renaud.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you for that. Renaud.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Thank you, Bobby. My turn to do the usual share screen feature. And then think, oops. There we go. Thank you for the invitation to share some results with you today. So I'm Renaud Legois, speaking from the campus of Université de Paris, and I would like to be with you in London today. So the main objective of this survey conducted with Ipsos Mori is to compare the perception of some of the key issues by the inhabitants of two major world cities. The question focuses on trajectories before and after lockdown orders, while taking into account the multiple scales and geographies in which both cities are embedded. I will focus on the results for the Greater Paris area, with some insights on the city of Paris or inner Paris, compared to Greater London, in order to give the English audience a sense of what has been deemed interesting in this survey for the French capital, from the French capital's perspective. I will cover several dimensions of the survey: the major concerns, the role of the neighborhood, the issues of outward mobility after the crisis, social issues and inequalities at stake, and finally, some environmental issues in a context of climate emergency, the other crisis that is already here. So our first comment will focus on the perception of the concerns. And generally speaking, the health crisis was the main concern for Parisians and Londoners at the time of the survey. However, the distribution of other concerns is a bit different. In Greater Paris, the first concern has been housing, the cleanliness of streets, parks, and public space, followed by air quality and pollution. For some of the inner suburbs of Greater Paris, however, we should say that crime and law enforcement is first in rank for the inner suburbs of Paris. In Greater London, the cost of living, policing, and housing are the major issues in order. So more than in Paris, concerns about the economy and employment have increased in London in 2 years, while Brexit is no longer deemed an issue, minus 17 points for the Brexit issue. As Jack already mentioned, the role of neighborhood life is an important element of what we call the walking city. it stands out as a major topic of satisfaction for metropolitan residents. And this is, I think, one of the good surprises of this survey. We should think of this while keeping in mind that during lockdowns, well, in France, we have been locked down within a 1 kilometer radius for 2 months, right? And during lockdown, many have dropped their car keys and rediscovered local parks, services, and local amenities. Data show that the 15-20 minutes area is appreciated by a vast majority of metropolitan residents, over 93% in Paris, 91% in Greater London, for the level of services and amenities in the neighborhood. In this very positive context, the stated preferences are clearly in favor of public transportation, good transport links, as major linkages with big city life. It is deemed essential for 29% of the Parisians and more significantly by 44% of inhabitants of Greater London. Elements related to safety, proximity to green spaces and health facilities are considered equally important by Londoners and Parisians, around 30%. Among the major issues at stake during the pandemic and its aftermath, the question of residential choice in the near future is paramount. After Jack's presentation, I just want to take the opportunity to comment a bit the proportion of Parisians who say they plan to leave downtown Paris in the next 5 years. The figure is 44%. And this has been rising since 2019. Indeed, we have to think about the demographic context. And this does not play in favor of Paris. Population has increased by only 0.1% a year over the last decade in Paris, while Greater London population grew 1% a year in the same time. The attractivity of Paris is at stake here. The inner city has lost inhabitants over the past 5 years. So the demographic gap between Paris and London extends to how immigration also is being perceived as a burden in Paris, as an opportunity in London. Londoners have a much more favorable view of immigration to the city than do Parisians. This shall be discussed in nuance. So, as Jack said, 61% of Londoners believe that immigration from abroad has a positive impact on city, compared to only 27% of the residents of Greater Paris. Nevertheless, what I want to say here, this attitude of Parisians is not only a distrust of immigrant population, but also a perception of Paris as an isolate. Only 34% of Greater Paris inhabitants see the arrival of population from other French regions as having a positive impact on the city, versus 58% in London. So there is a reluctance of Parisians towards new incoming population, and this is surprising. And it goes against the very structure of what means to be a capital city and a global city. I mean, a demographic place of redistribution, an economic place of redistribution with inflows and outflows. I'm moving to another issue to comment. Many other dimensions of our survey highlight how inequalities cut across the two capitals. Working at home has redefined the workplace during the crisis, at least for non-core functions that have massively shifted to telework. London seems particularly favorable to full-time work from home, 33%, which is consistent with the structure of its economic activity, whereas only 19% of Parisians say they can do it all the time. If we add partial telecommuting situation, 38% of Parisians have this option against 53% of Londoners. So much so that work from home may become a norm. Results in the inner suburbs of Paris, however, show that transportation, industrial and commercial functions are obviously reducing the potential for telework for residents of the inner suburbs. And there are clear figures on this in the survey. This being said, in order to work from home, one still needs to be able to find a place to live. The situation in terms of housing affordability is very bad. From the point of view of the adequacy between means, income and assets, and prices. 89% of the people questioned said they could not buy a property in London, 77% in Greater Paris. This problem stems from unequal access to housing. For salaried workers, only assets accumulated and not income actually allow to access property for a majority of households. As a result, only 27% of Greater Paris residents believe that housing is affordable for someone like them. This affordability crisis seems even more striking in London, where 20% of residents believe that it is still possible to find affordable housing. So what are the levers for policies in this context? The respondents were asked about the elements in which they were optimistic or pessimistic. The situation related to access to housing is the one on which the inhabitants are the most pessimistic. A vast majority think the situation will get worse in Paris and in London. Pollution and employment are also subjects of long-term pessimism, around 30% of the respondents. On the other hand, when the survey was carried out, the services shut down during lockdown orders were positively appreciated, and one wants to believe that the offer, the diversity, the accessibility will improve, whether it be public transport, in particular in Paris, with a lot of planned work and new subway lines, places of hospitality, bars, restaurants, cafes, parties, and culture, like theaters and museums. Last comment on environmental issues. It has been an important part of the survey. And we have seen that in Paris and in London, air quality and pollution were perceived as major issues for about 40% of respondents. So we asked about the opinion on a number of measures to improve air quality. A wide variety of measures are supported in both capitals by a majority of respondents. And this is an interesting outcome in terms of acceptability of our environmental policies against climate change. Pedestrian zones, reduction of car use are supported by a strong share of the inhabitants. For instance, downtown Paris has just introduced a 30 km/h speed limit. And the policy finds support in our survey by 49% in the Greater Paris and by a majority of 52% in downtown Paris, and even higher proportions for reducing speeds in London. On the other hand, and that will be my conclusion, some attitudes are a little dissonant with the general tone. For example, on this slide, the reallocation of road space to bicycles and walkers has very strong support in London, 51%, but has weaker support in Paris, and the debate is very lively, with only 39% of approval. On these few key elements of reflection, I'm sure we will come back during Q&As and following talks. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Renaud. If you can stop sharing your slides, Renaud, I can see everyone. There we are. Very, very good. Thank you so much for getting through that. And I think one of the key delights of a study like this is it just shows you the power of comparative research, pointing out what's the same and different between these two cities. Really helps us understand our own city as well as other places. So after that, to give their reflections on the findings, is we have, like I say, a truly brilliant panel. First, we'll hear from Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernardo, who is London's Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice, and we're really grateful for you taking the time to join us today, Debbie. Then we'll hear from Georgia Gould, who is Chair of London Councils and leader of Camden Council. Thank you so much, Georgia, for joining us too. Then it will be Kelly Beaver, who is Managing Director of Public Affairs at Ipsos Mori, Really looking forward to Kelly's reflections from huge experience of similar studies across cities and countries. And finally, we'll hear from Alan Simpson, who's acting CEO at London and Partners, the business growth agency for London, and his reflections on what the research tells us about the role of business and our place in the world will be excellent to hear as well. And of course, as I say, we want to hear from the audience too, so do submit your questions in the Q&A. We'll have time for that after the panel's reflections. But first up, over to you, Debbie.
Thank you so much, Bobby, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today to talk very briefly about what is happening in London as we are seeking to understand, comprehend and respond to the impacts of COVID and to move towards recovery. And it always feels odd to talk about recovery when we are all continuing to respond to COVID globally. And it's actually a really important time to be having this discussion as we prepare here in London and in the UK for additions to our vaccination rollout policy, as well as preparing to respond and react to the impact of the rolling back of many of the financial support packages that our national government introduced in the wake of the first wave. And this will kind of, I guess, reflect what I'd like to say in reflection on the research. These ongoing issues, I think, will certainly impact heavily on some of the groups in London which were hardest hit by COVID, either through its impact on health and death rates or from the measures introduced such as lockdown and restrictions on people's livelihoods. So all of these impacts are central to the way that we've developed our recovery plans in the city, with a clear acknowledgement that COVID only exacerbated inequality for groups that were already experiencing our city unequally, and therefore how it's been really necessary to centralise the tackling of those inequalities in our recovery work. It's really good, though, to see those insights that you've shared today, as data is actually really, really important to our understanding of people's experiences of the pandemic, but also to our approach to decision making and to service delivery. Back in 2019, we published the Survey of Londoners, which we did so to try to help us to fill some of our evidence gaps. We received around 6,000 responses from Londoners, and in filling those evidence gaps, it improved our understanding of the lives of diverse communities who live in our city, and in turn, it strengthened our policy making. And we'll be repeating that survey over the coming year. So I'd just like to reflect on just a couple of things in response to this really interesting research. All of these reflections, however, are around the importance of engaging with and giving voice to communities to help to drive policy change. Having data enables us to engage with our communities, which also helps immeasurably in giving voice to those communities and helping them to help us to understand the best solutions to some of the issues that they're experiencing. So it's really interesting to see in your report the disparity between different groups of people. That was similar to some of the data that we've collected, but also in particular around people's sense of belonging, the extent to which people feel part of their local areas, and also to understand how this made them feel about the cities that they live in, their desire not to leave and to want to stay and to enjoy the local amenities available to them. We've found that Londoners who have been treated unfairly because of a protected characteristic, because of their social class, those who lack economic resilience are those who are less likely, however, to agree that their local area is a place where people of different backgrounds get on well. They're more likely to feel isolated and lonely. They're less likely to engage and participate in cultural activities and events. So for me, what will be even more interesting is to see how that data is broken down across many of the very different groups who live in the city. Whilst we know that people from minority ethnic backgrounds actually report a very, very strong sense of belonging to their local areas, in London, we've got lots of very strong bonds within different groups, but not across those different groups. And we need to get better at understanding what we need to do to bridge those differences, to make people feel not only a sense of belonging to their city, but a sense of belonging to each other, and the way in which everyone mixes together and lives in that city together. But this is why I guess tackling inequality is central to work we do on social integration, because it's obviously hugely important for people to feel that they're able to contribute on an equal level to others, so that they're then able to want to engage with others. But also contributing equally plays a really important part in how they feel, how much they feel that they belong to a place. We saw lots of evidence in London during the pandemic, but also certainly across other parts of the UK, about having those strong local bonds within a community as being vital to supporting the fight against COVID. So people were coming together across the UK, but certainly in loads of pockets across the city, to deliver medicine, to deliver food and essentials to those who were clinically extremely vulnerable, those who were isolating and those who were lonely. But what we also discovered was that upsurge in community togetherness was not uniform. So there were clear gaps across geographical areas and within certain communities. So better off areas that have more established social and community-led infrastructure, better connected networks of residents, lower levels of isolation, higher levels of neighbourhood trust, and indeed higher levels of local participation, had stronger and more effective community responses. And these tended to be those parts of London which had low population churn also. And I think what all of this means is that our response to improving people's sense of belonging also needs to tackle inequality head on, but also to give people the tools that they need to drive change in their own communities. So in response to a lot of these issues, we've kickstarted a process of engaging with communities and helping them to develop the solutions to what they see as the way to get out of the situation in which we find ourselves, which is why it was really good to see how optimistic and positive people were about London being able to bounce back. We kickstarted this whole process this summer with a festival of ideas. We engaged with around 4,000 Londoners, and they were giving us their ideas and solutions for what a strong and resilient community could look like. And we've also developed something called a Community Strength Index, which will seek to define and measure civic strength at a London level. Our social recovery from the crisis, working in partnership with London's political leaders, London's boroughs. I'm really glad that Georgie Gould is speaking after me, because she's been integral to this development of this work, with London's businesses, but also with London's strong but often financially challenged civil society. That will provide people with the advice that they need to maximise their incomes. It will help them to secure their immigration status so that they can thrive, but also it will focus on creating some of those opportunities for those who are already disadvantaged in our labour markets, and try to tackle some of those issues around the cost of living that I saw the research also revealed. And also this will help to really open up opportunities for people to participate in the city, and importantly to have a say in what their recovery should look like, and ensuring that their voices and their ideas and their lived experiences help us to form those solutions to some of our most enduring inequities. I'm hoping that this type of engagement, this type of energy, this way of drawing on people's voices, be it through research or be it through direct engagement and improving dialogue, are the ways that we'll try to pull London back into recovery and out of the crisis caused by COVID. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Debbie. And great to make that link between hearing directly from people and getting their voices into these difficult policy decisions. Thank you very much. So, Georgia, over to you. Georgia, are you struggling to unmute? Oh, there we go.
Sorry, I just lost a connection for a second. Digital connectivity in London is and yeah, really delighted to follow Debbie, and we've been working really closely together as London government to respond to COVID and to recover from the pandemic. And I think a lot of the issues that come up in the polling really link to the work that we're doing around recovery. And I'm really delighted to be here because in Camden, we're home to the Paris-London connection through the Eurostar. We like to think of ourselves as the gateway to Europe. And I'm sitting in Kentish Town, where we have a big French population because of the Lycée School, and lots of connections there. So it's wonderful to see the positive way we as Londoners and Parisians view each other's cities. And I was quite amused in the report that said both of us think we have the best food. So I hope that the panel is not going to be asked to come to a conclusion on that. But I was really pleased as a local government leader to see the positive response to local services in both cities. And I think the pandemic has shown the power of local government. I think we saw that often national solutions, especially large-scale outsourced centralised programmes, just didn't work. So the billions spent on test and trace are a great example of that. And in local government, we were saying from the beginning, we have staff, housing staff, community outreach teams that have those links into communities, and we are better placed to do this work. And I think where we've seen real success is where councils have come together with community partners, other bits of the public sector, these mutual aid groups that have sprung up, as Debbie said, and acted really quickly to support communities. And we saw in every place food distribution systems set up, in often a few days. And we drew on the strengths of our local communities, and I think that we've seen citizens really respond to that and feel a much deeper sense of place. People have also been at home a lot more, so we've seen more, real hyperlocal issues emerging as people have become very aware of the pollution or the rubbish or the different issues in their streets. So I think it's a really positive shift, that link to local services, and I really hope that both national governments will see the opportunity there, and that we will see a huge devolution agenda, although I don't hold my breath. And I thought in the report, a lot of the challenges very much resonated. I wanted to pick out housing in a London context, because we are seeing a kind of crisis of affordability in London, and we've seen a 74% increase in the median house price in London over the last decade, and the private rented sector and the owner-occupier market is increasingly unaffordable for the average wage earner in our city. And I come from a central London borough where we now have the lowest birth rate in the country, and it is largely because families are just forced to move out. We have families who are in council housing, but many families who can afford to would like to own a home, but when the average house price in Camden is £800,000, people just can't afford to do. I went to a local school in Camden. I've seen increasingly my friends, as they got to that age where they're having children, move out of the city, and it's a huge issue. And I think it's a real dilemma in terms of policy making, because there's one approach, which is that we really start to look, which we should do anyway, but at the private rented sector, which is very unregulated and insecure. And there's a question about, as a home-owning country, can we in urban centres provide stable private rented sector accommodation that people want to live in long term? Or we need to think really seriously about how we have affordable housing to buy in cities. But it's we can go into the detail of the housing policy, but it's very difficult. We definitely need a huge government investment in council housing, which includes cities, because I think it would be a real tragedy if the centre of London, which is full of opportunity, becomes somewhere that where families are pushed out and unable to grow up and to engage in that opportunity. So I think it's a kind of urgent area of public policy, and I think we also need to look beyond housing targets to have a much greater focus on place making. What's the social infrastructure, green spaces that go in when we put in housing developments? So that comes out as a massive policy challenge. And I think the other area I just wanted to mention is the level of inequality we've seen in London. I thought Debbie just spoke powerfully about that, but the pandemic, I think, has highlighted and exposed the inequalities that we have been well aware of for a long time. And we saw COVID have a disproportionate impact on our Black and Asian and minority Londoners, but also the lockdown showed just how close to financial insecurity so many people were. And we've seen tens of thousands of people calling the council because they don't have access to food, and they're in an emergency situation. We saw large numbers of school children who couldn't learn from home because they didn't have access to the internet. There might be one phone in the house that maybe they couldn't afford to top up. and the extent that people were cut out of education because of those inequalities is a huge challenge and something that we're trying to address. So I think it requires a real focus, and I think one of the dangers of it, certainly in the UK, the levelling up agenda is it ignores the inequalities within cities and only focuses on regional inequality, and that they're both important dimensions, but we need to look at them both together, and there is huge inequality in London. And then final quick point about the climate crisis and the kind of support for a just transition that I think came out of this report, and just interesting that that high support for pedestrianisation and cycle routes doesn't always play out in debates in the community. So anyone from London who is here will know what I'm talking about. And I think that there is a vocal minority that sometimes maybe distort the debate, or that it's something that is more attractive sometimes in the abstract than in the specific. So I think the kind of contested nature of our roads is going to continue to be a massive question for us, but really interesting work, and I hope we can stay part of that dialogue and strengthen the connection between our two cities.
Oh, brilliant. That was excellent. Thanks, Georgia. Really important points about the diversity within the cities and the impact of the pandemic on making those inequalities worse, which will be a key theme in the work that we would want to pick up on the back of this. Great, so I'm going to move straight on to Kelly Beaver. Kelly.
Thank you. And it's just to say, first of all, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with you and the team again, Bobby, and also University of Paris again this year, looking at the differences between the two cities, but also things that are similar. There are just three things I was going to say over and above what others have reflected on. The first one is really to reflect a little bit on the context in when this research was actually conducted and what that means about how we can interpret the findings. So yes, there is a pandemic, and I know we've structured this as cities and COVID, but actually over the last 2 years, there have been lots of second order events which have actually shaped the views and experiences of those who live in both cities, Paris, London, and actually many cities around the world. Black Lives Matter has really heightened awareness of social and racial injustice. The death of Sarah Everard in London, which occurred 6 weeks before this survey was conducted, will most definitely have influenced some of the patterns we're picking up. And also Brexit, which has had an impact on trade and immigration patterns and who lives and works in London, as Jack touched on briefly. So it might be some context in why we're seeing some things like women in London much more concerned about harassment than in Paris, much more heightened awareness of it. And also the concern about economy of jobs higher in London. So it's really important that we look at these snapshots, but also keep tracking so that we can see whether these issues are going to keep being significant concerns and whether ultimately public concern and public pressure to do something about the social injustices that have been flagged earlier will actually to keep coming. We know things like cost of living is a perennial issue for many cities, including London. They're constant, but will some of the other issues that we're picking up fade into the distance in the years ahead? I hope not. Secondly, I just wanted to really look at the surveys from the aspect of how much they give us by way of informing some of the priorities for building back better. We can see clearly for people, it's not just about jobs, it's not just about the economy, it's about social inequalities, it's about environmental improvements. And there are significant differences we see by city, but also within cities by gender, by age, by proximity to city centre. And the richness of this data, when properly mined, will really be very helpful for mayoral teams who are going to be dealing with, as has been touched on already, a lot of different competing priorities. For example, cost of living, big challenge for younger citizens in both cities, really high levels of concern. In Paris, concern about the environment is largely restricted to younger people, while in London, we can see it shared right across the age groups almost evenly. And for older citizens, concerns about things, day-to-day stuff like traffic levels and road conditions are ranking higher, but so does things like crime and policing and public disorder. So there's real differences beneath the data sets, which will be important to get a good understanding of when we look at prioritising in the recovery period, which I hope we are starting to be in. And then finally, just I loved as a Londoner, I consider myself a Londoner, even though I do sound very Irish. I love the fact that this research continues to dispel the myths that the city is dead, because we know from other work, yes, the pandemic has definitely accelerated pre-existing trends, things like online accessing of services and retail and the hybrid working, reductions in office space, etc. You know, those are not good trends for high density urban centres. But and they definitely will undermine things like agglomeration models that really make cities work. So mass public transport, inner city regeneration, and those are going to be challenges. But we see in this data, and Jack points it out in particular in his slides, really, the attractiveness of London might have waned. People might be concerned about the future improvements in the environment and the cost of house prices, etc. But actually, if you look at it, the population estimates are both cities are still growing, not massively and not as much as they did in non-pandemic years, but they are both still in growth according to the latest data that I've seen. So it's clear both cities have the ability to withstand significant shocks. They have done before: riots, fires, other pandemics, as was mentioned earlier. And cities do have a way of reinventing themselves. So ultimately, it's nice to see the data coming through that the residents themselves believe that cities will reinvent themselves, they will recover, but also a recognition that it's going to take time, especially with the range of priorities and with some of the financial constraints that both countries and ultimately cities will face coming out of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That's great. Thanks very much. And finally, Alan from the panel.
Yeah, hello everyone. Sorry, my voice is going a bit. I've just spent 2.5 hours in front of a committee talking about my governance, which is a lot less interesting than this is. I think I'm here to talk about the sort of the economic perspective on London. And for those of you who don't know London and Partners, we are the international promotion agency for London. We bring businesses to London from our offices around the world, including in Paris. We also do London promotion, normally international. At the moment, you can imagine we're focusing on London's domestic tourism recovery, working with Georgia and other London leaders to try and support the 1 in 5 Londoners who work in hospitality, leisure and retail. I'm going to focus quite a bit on that because I think it's often the untold story when we think about crisis recovery. At the start of the pandemic, we looked to see what the history of pandemics and epidemics around the world has been and the way that economies recover, particularly economies who are very exposed to tourism. And it turns out that there's a very regularly repeated model, which is essentially a supply side constraint, not a demand side. So immediately that the epidemic pandemic hits, this is true in SARS, Ebola, swine flu, etc. Demand for travel just stops, and it stays stopped until, crucially, the formal barriers to travel are removed, and then demand flows back very, very quickly, much more quickly than is commonly understood when we talk about the future return kind of international global travel, whether it's for tourism or for business. And I think the reason that we get this wrong often is because we ask people when you think you'll travel. But of course, what you're actually asking is how nervous are you today? People are very bad at judging their future perception of risk. Better, therefore, to look at the past. And the travel comes back very quickly, which for a city like London really matters. But it comes back in a very specific shape. People visit places closer to them than the further away places, and they visit places they think are safer. And yes, they mean safer in terms of the pandemic, but frankly in other ways too. So you get this blue chip effect, a bit like in a financial crisis, where regardless of what caused the crisis, people invest in big blue chips, including banks. Similarly, yes, there may have been some challenges in the way that the UK and other centres like the US handled the crisis, but they're seen as blue chip centres, so they're seen as safe. The constraint then in the long term is about the ability to meet the demand, because the demand comes back. It's about the supply, and we are seeing supply lagging behind. So the issue in London of inability to find chefs, inability to find front of house staff, is what is constraining the consumer recovery, not demand. Right, and this is true in much of the rest of the world as well. So, you know, in the UK, if you're in Cornwall or in Yorkshire, there are more people wanting to sit down for dinner than there are tables for them to sit at. Right? So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. What's the history? The history is that the problem is essentially a supply one, not a demand one, in both the short, medium and long term. Moving into what we're seeing now, well, we're seeing that play out. So the people who can get to London, domestic travellers, domestic investors are, with the constraints on supply, which is what barriers at the borders are fundamentally, constraining the ability of the supply to meet the demand of international. But because of the fact that redundancies in the UK are lower than we thought they might be, partly driven by the furlough scheme, partly driven by the supply side problem, there's not a lot of capacity left in the system. So the short-term ability of London to meet the demand for spend is therefore limited. What is interesting though, and again is true if you look at previous pandemics and epidemics, international investment into international centres has continued to be very resilient, because in effect international investors are betting on the future. So international investors are saying, yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but you know, things will only get better. A joke for Georgia there. So in London, London has had more international investments than any other centre in the last few years. Last year, it was the strongest in the world, with 492 new FDI projects and about 13,000 jobs in the year created through international investment. So weirdly, actually, there was this resilience for cross-border trade and investment, which for London is a counterpoint to the apparent constraint in the ability of the consumer economy, which, as I say, is 1 in 5 jobs to meet the demand. So that's what's happening now. I want to move on to the future and something I'm deeply worried about. And I noticed looking through the data which was shared here, there's some interesting data on the way that people are thinking about home working. At the moment in London, and I know this is true in Paris as well, from speaking to my head of mission there, the current debate is essentially that employers want people back, employees broadly don't want to come back, and that there's an impact on the consumer economy directly, and maybe some slightly more abstract impacts on the economy for the jobs who don't want to come back. For me, that's a very short-term dynamic, and I don't think it's the right way to think about the risk for a city like London. Yes, of course, home working impacts the consumer economy, of course it does. But if you say to an employer, my job as a designer does not require me to be in the office, I could be in Birmingham, I could be in Manchester, I could be in North Wales, eventually an employer hears, your job is outsourceable. And I think we will get very quickly to a point where white-collar workers, skilled white-collar workers, find that the home working dynamic creates, at the very least, demand pressures in the economy of cities like London, when people realise that they can employ, you know, I've got 3 offices in India, I've got legal structures there, I could employ teams in India if I wanted to, that they can employ people more cheaply in India. So we will find that a lot of jobs which are perhaps artificially inflating in price at the moment will, in the longer term, find that they're basically experiencing price arbitrage constraints against China, India, and other high skill, lower cost centres. So I think there's going to be fascinating inversion for cities like London, Paris, New York, where the debate about home working becomes less about 15-minute cities and the impact on the consumer economy, and more the fact that the almost necessary logical progression of that argument is that we as people who were formerly in offices find that they're competing on price with professionals in Bangalore as much as they are professionals elsewhere in London. So those are 3 things I wanted to cover. What can we learn from previous pandemics? It turns out that it's a supply side issue in terms of international exposure. Where are we now? Well, the economy is doing rather better than we thought it would, and that means that there's relatively little capacity left. What does the future look like? I think we need to be clear that home working is probably in the long run as challenging for office workers as it is for the consumer economy. And I'll stop there.
Brilliant. That's excellent. Thank you so much, Alan. And it's a theme I actually wanted to pick up on in a kind of first discussion among the panel in some ways, because it is this is a survey of residents, a lot of whom will be workers within the city, but it's not the full population of workers. And we at King's are starting on a different project that will be looking at workers and what are they thinking about coming back and not coming back, because I think that is a crucial dynamic in this. Can I just ask a question of you, Alan, and then open up to others, because it is, yes, I can see that longer term imperative to then when those boundaries are broken, you can go anywhere for your labour, those types of things. Absolutely. What are you thinking in terms of timeframes for that? Because I think we're focused on this short-term reduction, knock-on effects, and all sorts of consumptions. These types of shifts, you say, is this like a horizon scanning point, or is it something that you see coming?
So this is where we get into boring conversations about net gross and stock. Ultimately, we should be interested in the stock of jobs in a city, right? So one of the inputs into that is inflow of jobs, gross job creation, which I'm responsible with my team for supporting international job creation, inflow of jobs. One thing we are seeing already is that the relative number of jobs an inward investor into London and other cities around the world, the same is true of Paris, same is true of New York, intends to create as part of that investment is going down. Now that's partly about short-term risk management, i.e. now's a funny time to invest, so we'll go in smaller and grow later. But we're also getting reports back that that investors perceive that they can distribute their skills base more. So where before somebody might have come to London or to Paris with 50 jobs immediately growing to 100, now that might be 20 jobs, because the perception is, well, they can employ some of those skills elsewhere. So the first thing that you would expect logically to happen in terms of corporate behavior is that new investments are restructured. The process for restructuring in existing employee bases will obviously lag behind that. But we will start to see the stock reduced by the fact that the gross input is slowing. And of course, you always get the churn of business losses during a recession.
Okay, so it's a process that starts quickly, but will take some time to feed through because of the stock point. Yeah, very good. I wonder, Georgia or Debbie, have any reflections on that from your own perspective?
Yeah, it's something we've been thinking a lot when we think about the economic recovery of London. And I think I wanted to go back to the point I was making about placemaking, because what Arup did a report on central London's economy, and I think that really emphasised the importance of place, the importance of giving an incentive for people to come into central London, whether that's a cultural offer or thinking differently about the kind of spaces we create. So I think it's not that's both as the public sector and the private sector. It's not enough just to have offices. If we're really serious about creating innovation districts and proximity being an incentive for investment, then we need to create spaces for collaboration, and we need to think a lot more thoughtfully about how we create places of work that enable meaningful collaboration between different sectors, that enable connection to community, which have great spaces that people want to be in. And rather than just take for granted that people will make that long commute every day. And I also think it, again, highlights the importance of having a mix of housing in central London. So you know, you're not just relying on long commutes. But I think we do still think people coming together and working in person, at least for some of the time, will be part of the future of London's economy, and that we will need to be thinking more thoughtfully about that as London's government, about creating those new kind of spaces for a future workforce.
Georgia. And Debbie, anything from your point of view?
So I suppose from my perspective, there's two things. The first is that when it came to thinking about those who are working from home and those who are not, there's a clear division between those who were more likely to be able to work from home, so the types of sectors that people were working in, and those who, quite frankly, have either been going to work throughout this entire pandemic because of the types of jobs that they're in, or they were working in sectors which were really rather insecure. So when the first wave hit, we saw that there were certain groups of people who were in quite insecure types of work, who were either forced to go out to work and not feel properly protected, or who lost their jobs almost instantly and were not able to avail themselves of any of the national government protections. So I think about this in a sort of a slightly different way. I'm really keen to make sure that we have, and this is something that I know that we've been working with Georgia on when we're thinking about our recovery. I'm more interested in us thinking about a labour market which isn't as occupationally segregated as it was before the pandemic hit, because there are certain groups of people who are more likely to be able to work in sectors and in jobs in which there is no possibility to be able to work from home. And sometimes those are jobs which are less secure, which are less well paid, and they're more likely to be made up of women, of those from certain minority ethnic communities, and also from certain migrant communities. So it's really important for us to also think about those who are not necessarily able to avail themselves of the work from home possibility. And then the other thing, I guess, is that I know that so the ONS has reported that we've got a real increase in vacancies and jobs. So we've got a skills issue, because whilst there are vacancies, we know that there are not that there's not enough people to fill them, but people do not have the correct skills potentially to be able to fill them. And also in the light of Brexit, and it's something that we obviously think about an awful lot at the Mayor's office, we know that there are lots of individuals who might have worked in certain sectors who are no longer around to be able to do so. So it's really important for us to think about what London's labour market looks like in terms of those who are able to fill vacancies, what is the skills offer that we are able to provide, and what are we saying to those individuals who have left, might want to return and feel unable to because of the way in which Brexit has sort of ruined their ability to be able to come back and to fill those vacancies.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. And that relates to some of the themes that are coming up in the questions from the audience. Some great questions. Thank you for those. I'm going to start there with a quite general one, and for people involved in the research, I guess. And it's always a good one to ask is, what's the most surprising aspects of the research? And it's not going to be that Parisians think their food is better, because I think that was probably the least surprising finding in the whole study. But this probably pointed more at Jack, Renaud and Kelly. What surprised you? Because that, and I suppose a little addendum is, what do we do about that? Or what do we learn from that?
Well, I think actually, Bobby, that both cities thought they had better food.
That's even less surprising.
That was surprising.
Yeah,
well, it's surprising in a way, but it's a measure of incredible progress, because I think that would not have been the case a few decades ago. That I wouldn't say that's the most surprising necessarily. I guess I put my sort of most surprisings at the beginning. It's this idea. I think that if you read certain newspapers, perhaps both of the left and the right, there's a bit of a narrative that London is a kind of a necessary evil to be endured because the jobs are here, and the results on people actually liking their neighbourhoods and wanting to stay here, I thought were not surprising, but perhaps challenged the narrative a bit. There is one thing that we haven't mentioned. In fact, there's tons that we haven't mentioned. It's a very wide-ranging study. And we've given sort of headlines, but as both Georgia and Debbie pointed out, sort of breaking down the London results by different groups, you do really see the disparities. Inequality is very important aspect of this research. But the zoomed out stuff, we asked a question on levelling up. Do you think London gets its fair share of central government spending? I'm really very surprised by how many Londoners, as much as 30% of Londoners, thought that London either got a little too much or much more than its fair share. So this idea that the levelling up narrative is kind of, Londoners are kind of tending to agree with it. Whatever the explanation for that, I thought was really, really fascinating, particularly as I'm not personally someone who would necessarily agree with that line of thinking. But I thought that was really, really quite interesting.
Yeah, no, fascinating. It's a sort of misperception based on a rhetoric that people pull in because it's not factually correct. But Londoners, and the contrast with Paris was quite striking because it's not repeated there. This is not just all capital city dwellers thinking they get a better deal. This is a London thing, which does show you that narrative matters on this. And I think there's more to look at there, I think, as well. So, Renaud, perhaps you could, what surprised you?
Yes, thank you. I actually answered the question in the chat. So views from Paris, and the most surprising aspect, I think, the attitude of Parisians towards immigration is striking. So the difference, especially between Paris and London, and I was a bit surprised of the results regarding migration from other regions in France. That was absolutely unexpected. So this is something we need to dive into, to think about, and probably to get a better understanding of the results. Given the political context in France, we could expect an attitude toward immigration from abroad. But I mean, that was a surprise. The good surprise, because there are good surprises, is the level of approval for speed regulation and environmental policies, especially downtown Paris. This is a little bit counterintuitive, given the general tone of the media regarding the policies adopted in Paris recently, and the level of approval, even from the first string of the suburbs, the inner suburbs, is pretty good for the measures. It's a bit counterintuitive. So this is part of the surprises.
Very good. And Kelly, anything? Your perspective?
Well, so obviously that Londoners think their food is better than Paris. That was a shock. I do love London food as well. I think actually, no, I didn't have a lot of surprises, but bear in mind, I've been asked to do a lot of presentations on cities since the pandemic started. There seems to be a fascination with the narrative around death of cities. But what I was mooting the whole time, and it got worse during the second lockdown, people were really worried about cities dying and not coming back to life again. And I didn't have at that stage the level of evidence that we actually get through this studies, that there is significant optimism amongst the population about it recovering. And that was a nice data point for us to be able to share from this. Because before I was just sharing experiences of previous pandemics, and it's all been okay in the past, when actually we can see the citizens themselves believe that it will recover as well and are behind the recovery. Cities have never been popular. Less than a quarter of people would choose to live in a city, they say, in both France and in England. And that's been the same before and after this pandemic. That hasn't really changed. But the people who live in the city, they like it, they're satisfied, and that's quite comforting too.
Thank you, Kelly. That's great. And then, as I say, there's some themes that keep coming up in the questions around Brexit and what that does for our relations, and around housing in particular, and what do we do about that. But just to pick on one to start with about transportation, because I think that is one where the comparisons of the two cities is really interesting. So the question is, there is a real statement first is there's a real need to find ways to incentivize and motivate citizens to give up the right to independent transportation. Local and national government need to focus on this very rapidly, because people have taken to driving cars more often during the pandemic. And there is this sort of in broader work that I'm doing about the safety aspects of perceived safety aspects of private versus public transportation. So what do the panel have? What ideas did the panel have on how to achieve this? And maybe come to Georgia first, because you touched on that a bit, from being slightly skeptical of Londoners' apparent acceptance of giving up roads.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not skeptical of. I think there is a majority in favour. It's just that it is a very contested issue. I think it's a great question, and I think there is a lot happening already. I think the first is that we need kind of good and safe alternatives. So London needs to be a much better city for cyclists and pedestrians, and we hear a lot from our communities that the biggest barrier to cycling is people think it's unsafe in London, and it in parts of London it is, and there's been a massive post-COVID investment in new cycle and pedestrian infrastructure, which has been somewhat controversial in some places. But I think that we need to change our city in order to encourage people to do so. I mean, I think we should look seriously at a new kind of proper road pricing system across the city. I mean, it's very complicated to do, but we have the congestion charging zone and the low emission zones. But we could look at a fundamental transformation of a road pricing system. Be a big shift in London, but that might be a way of a fair way of discouraging people from using cars who don't need to use cars. And then I think that there remains inequalities over those who have access to bicycles, to the public transport system. And I think the more that we can do to support Londoners, for example, who are looking for work, to have cheaper access to public transport. The challenge we have is that there's been huge cuts from national budgets to transport for London. And Transport for London's budget has kind of been caught up in a kind of national political fight, unfortunately. And I know that the Mayor of London's fought very hard to keep the concessions that we do have, but it would be brilliant if we could see a new level of investment in public transport in London. And the final thing I'd say is if any of my colleagues from parts of London which do have less transport infrastructure, that there are places in London that are hard to get around on public transport. And again, that investment would make a real difference in bringing in new roads. We don't know what's going to happen with Crossrail 2, which seems to have been left on the back burner. But those new transport projects would bring more capacity in and open up more parts of the city.
Debbie, did you want to come in on this from London? I would like to hear from Renaud from Paris perspective after that. Just interesting contrast, but yeah, Debbie.
Well, I mean, just to add to what Georgia has said, we have been really, really clear that it's massively important to tackle air pollution. We know that some of our most disadvantaged communities live in some of the most polluted parts of the city. And so it's about making this an issue in which everyone recognises that it's more of a social justice issue. So it's about trying to bring communities to it's better to walk, it's better to cycle, it's better for your health, and also you do actually live and work in some of the parts of the city in which your health is really being more severely impacted than others. I suppose, and I would say this, but it's just about trying to ensure that we bring communities along with us. And Georgia is correct when she says that it is a contested space. When we talk about some of the changes that we sought to make, in relation to low traffic neighbourhoods, in relation to the ultra low emission zone, which is due to start next month, which will try to remove some of the most polluting vehicles from major roads in the city. That all of that has become quite contested, and there are many local residents from all sorts of different backgrounds who are finding this change quite difficult. And so it's really about making sure that we bring our communities along with us on the journey. Some of that is about pointing to the social justice issue, but some of it is also about making sure that they're as involved as possible in the way in which we make our decisions, so they don't feel as though it's being imposed on them, and that it's something that they've felt a part of, and that's definitely something that we are continuously working to try to do as effectively as possible.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Maybe hear from Alan from London perspective before we come to Renaud for that contrast point.
Yeah, I just wanted to really strongly agree with the points made there about transport being primarily a social justice issue. We tend inside the UK, and I know the same is true in France, to talk about transport as an issue of social justice in the connections between the capital city and the rest of the country. But if you look at London, particularly London, actually, there's not many cities for whom this is quite as true. Connectivity into what we call the CAZ, the Central Activity Zone, is the defining feature really of the economic success of London's kind of satellite communities. And it's no coincidence that the parts of London which are most economically privileged are the parts which have easier access. And one of the early speakers talked about the risk of losing the agglomeration effects of cities. And this is a profoundly important point. Yes, of course, the 15-minute city agenda is a useful way of bring both economic strength and dignity to communities. But ultimately, Wimbledon in London is wealthy because everyone in Wimbledon works in the square mile. It is connectivity that is one of the conditions. It's not the only condition, but a condition of growth in London's outer boroughs, and it is striking. I live in southeast London. It's striking how undistributed access to easy transport is, and how closely, not totally, not 100%, but how closely it maps against the economic performance and so wider social justice issues in those boroughs. And I think Debbie makes a really profound point here that we should dwell on.
Yeah. Thank you, absolutely. So Renaud, it did stand out from the 2019 study, the contrast in perceptions across the two cities. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the contrast is striking. At least I again insist on the pretty good level of approval of reducing traffic speeds, reallocating spaces, funding cycle routes and so on in Paris and in the vicinity and suburbs of Paris. But I think all these measures tackle with at least three difficulties, three main problem. First main problem, main issue is history. And basically, it's very hard to transform a city like Paris against an history of car dependency, and especially car dependency that has been sustained and promoted by subsidies from the state from years. The entire car-based system has been subsidized for decades. So it's not only a political transformation, but it's also an educational transformation on how you access to different kind of transportation. And I mean, City of Paris pushes a lot of new incentives on using bicycles or walking to work. The Greater Paris Authority is developing an entire new subway system, high-speed subway system, to connect suburb to suburb and to keep working the agglomeration system. But at the same time, there is still an issue, which is education to adopt the new behavior in terms of transportation. And when I mean education, I mean how you transform the attitude of users towards bicycle lanes, for instance, so as not using bicycle lanes are parking spots. This is one example I can discuss. I mean, for the moment, with this level of approval, the main issue is not to think about the next step ahead, because the decisions are pretty easy to do for the city of Paris. The next move is how you change the behavior of people towards transportation, and this is a hard thing. It's not only politics.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of time, Jack. Is it a quick addendum to that?
I'll be very quick, just to add something on transport. Just had a quick look back at the 2019 polling. London does really well for public transport when compared to Paris. Sorry, Renaud. In terms of the sort of approval rating, if you like, in terms of affordability, safety, reliability. So this is really good. Very quick second point now, to go back to something that Georgia mentioned. TfL's finances are in a crisis, very reliant on central government. And if we go back to the levelling up point, who knows if that's, I don't want to stop being optimistic here, but who knows if that funding is going to keep being provided and secured to keep that public transport offering particularly good. Sorry, I've gone a bit downbeat there.
Don't worry, we've had lots of upbeat elements. Good to have a balance. So I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. But I do have my final introduction to make. to Professor Clarisse Bertuzan, who has been sitting there incredibly patiently during this session. Clarisse is Professor of Modern British History and Vice President of University of Paris, and she's actually the key person within the partnership. She's been leading the partnership between King's and Paris from the Paris end, and she's been absolutely perfect for that role, and it's been a delight to work with Clarisse. And before we wrap up, I just really wanted to hear Clarisse's reflection, particularly, I guess, looking forward.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure working with all of you. I'd like to say how pleased I am that this event is taking place. In fact, this double event, since I was chairing this morning, and this is why I can sort of sit and listen this afternoon. Even though the event is online, the original plan, of course, was to have breakfast in Paris and drinks in London in the evening. But I know we'll have more opportunities to do that because, and this is my very quick first point, this is only the starting point of the work that our teams at Université de Paris and King's College, along with Ipsos, are going to be doing, because in fact, the data is very, very vast and rich. And as you may have understood, it's the result of 2 series of investigations and fieldwork in 2019 and 2021. And so the findings will lead to an ongoing series of scientific publications and blogs, events, conferences, as our teams continue to analyze them. So this is only just the very beginning, and it will inform future research programs between our 2 universities. The second point is I just wanted to underline how original this research was, because it spans 2 periods of lockdowns, both in Paris and London, and also that it plays on different scales, looking simultaneously at central Paris and greater Paris, central London and greater London. And there's been much debate, which I'll spare you now, about how these really compare, central Paris to central London, etc. And this leads me to a third quick point about the importance of comparative research, is that precisely as we were sort of debating about how central Paris was compared to London, etc., this was key to raising new questions, raising questions differently, looking at them from a different angle. Comparative research can be extremely tricky because you can, in fact, reinforce cliches and stereotypes and myths rather than dispel them. So there's danger there. And that's why I think it's very, very important to work collectively on that, to have teams and to make the comparison, to build this comparison in new constructive ways. And I'd really like to thank very, very much all the team from both cities for their work. Finally, last point. This research is the result of important partnership between King's College and Université de Paris. Université de Paris is a very, very young university, merging from Paris Diderot and Paris Descartes. And what our universities have in common is that they're located at the heart of capital cities, and they have very similar social missions, placing cutting-edge research at the service of society. We both have strong tradition of interdisciplinarity, and in our previous universities in France, the founding members of our merger, and we both want to address global issues and build new nexus of research together and social engagement for the people of our cities. And we're very much hoping that this research will contribute to better lives in both our cities. And we definitely hope that this research will be applicable to other capital cities, and that we will have other universities joining us in this research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clarisse. And it was lovely to hear a French siren going off in the background. I've been sitting here with my London-based sirens going off. It was like almost like we were together. Next time we do the study, we will definitely be together. And that's it from me as well. I mean, I just want to echo that one final point from Clarisse, which is a really important one, is we very much see this, the London-Paris comparison, as the start of a program where adding in other cities other global cities or other comparable cities to that will be, it just add to the richness of that comparative understanding. So that's how we see that taking this forward. And if there's anyone who's interested in how do we roll that out, how do we bring other universities and other city governments on board, then just please do get in touch. But for now, it's just left for me to thank the teams in King's and University of Paris for organising the two events that we've had today. To Ipsos Mori for their partnership on the research, excellent as always. To all of the audience for attending. And of course, finally, to our brilliant panel. Thank you all very much. A brilliant discussion.